Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast, back with another article review. Today, I want to look at a really interesting new paper by Mark Williams and Nikki Hodges, which is kind of looking at where the state of play for skill acquisition research and how it's applied, like how far we've come and where we need to go, how much progress we made. And so and then they propose kind of this framework to of how, what we've learned. So I think it's a really interesting look at where we are and where we need to go. So here's the paper: Effective Practice and Instruction Skill Acquisition Framework for Excellence, or SAFE. Mark posted this on LinkedIn. All right, it's coming out soon. I guess it's been accepted for publication, so I'm not sure when it will come out, but I think you can still find it on LinkedIn, a free copy. If you look on the show notes, there's a link I posted there. So Mark Williams and Nikki Hodges. So the paper builds what they've done is an interesting thing. They built off this paper they wrote about 20 years ago, a very popular paper called Practice, Instruction, and Skill Acquisition in Soccer: Challenging Tradition, Journal of Sports Science in 2005. And this paper, what it did was it called out three very common practices, things we do in practice that don't agree with skill acquisition, what they called the myths of practice design. Right. And they pointed these out, how there's this inconsistency, what's done on the field and what research shows. And and what they wanted to see in this current paper is how far have we come in addressing these and what do we still need to do? Right. So these potential myths in coaching practice: one, demonstrations are always effective in conveying information to the learner. Myth two: specific block practice of a single skill is essential for skill learning, the fundamentals assumption I've been referring to over the last few weeks. Myth three: augmented feedback from a coach should be frequent, detailed, and provided as soon as possible after the skill has been performed. Myth four: prescriptive coaching is always better for skill acquisition than instructional approaches based on learning guided by guided discovery. And myth five: game intelligence skills are not amenable to practice and instruction. So a lot of the things we're fighting against in ecological dynamics, they identified here back in this paper in 2005. So the first thing they want to do is look at how far they've come. Um, so where are we now? How we made progress, right? Skill acquisitions. So in some ways we have, some ways we haven't. Skill acquisition specialists are not typically part of the support teams, and there's no training programs directly related to development of the profession, right? I guess I'm but a bit of an exception. I'm obviously a skill acquisition specialist with the Boston Red Sox. Um, so they, there's we've come some ways, I guess, the fact that I have a job, but we still have a long way to go in terms of getting skill acquisition recognized as an important part of training. A second point: the increasing popularity of constraints-based and ecological dynamics approaches to motor skill acquisition, spurred by the growth in podcasts advocating this approach, has provided a potential framework by which coaches become more hands-off rather than hands-on in coaching. So it challenged those myths of over-coaching, over-instruction, being prescriptive. Ecological dynamics has provided a way to get away from that. I really appreciate Mark and Nikki acknowledging the positive impact of podcasts, as opposed to other people who shall remain nameless, who call us purveyors of bullshit. Right? That's literally the title of their paper. These people recognize the positive impact that podcasts have had in disseminating research, getting discussion going, presenting new ideas. Right? So I appreciate that. I appreciate them recognizing that. So so from this, they're going to develop a skill acquisition framework. Again, they're going to try to sit above theory, right? Drawing knowledge from all different approaches and coming up with some kind of general principles without referring to any one theory. You're probably going to guess, I'm not going to agree that they're successful. A framework has broad implications, somewhat independent of the reader's theoretical bias, right? These general rules, things we need to focus on that we've learned from practice design. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going, what they're going to present in this paper at the end, um, as they go. Okay, so this SAFE framework, the SAFE model. Okay, so and what they what so the new those myths, we've successfully challenged some of them. What they're gonna This framework has 5 action points that we still need to address. Okay, so We've moved away from overly prescriptive coaching of always instruction, and yes, we've done that. Now we need to do other things. So these are the 5 things they think in this model that are general things that still need to be addressed. Find the right balance of practice between focusing on long-term learning and short-term performance. Action point 2, focus on the quality of practice rather than merely on the practice quantity. Action point 3, create practice conditions that are specific to the competition setting. Action point 4, consider individual differences in how learning would respond to different interventions. And action point 5, facilitate learning during practice rather than dictate or abdicate. Right. So some good, very good points that, I think in ecological dynamics, we feel we're addressing. And we'll talk about that later on. Okay. So action point 1, find the right balance in practice between focusing on long-term learning and short-term performance. Okay. They bring out the point here and some really good, a lot of this is, bringing up Nikki and Keith Loesch's paper, Extended Challenge, some of the that I reviewed last year, right? So they bring out the point, do not always see what we get, right? We get good performance. We get this false sense of security that learning is going on and people are getting better, when people are actually, they're not learning anything because it's too easy. And vice versa, poor performance does not always imply that no learning is taking place, right? So we need to be careful about assessing things by performance. So they point out there are clear implications for coaches and researchers regarding measures of performance, learning, and transfer. Periods of rest are necessary to best evaluate learning over time and under conditions that represent the relevant sensory, emotional, and cognitive states of the potential transfer environment. An evaluation of learning based on the rate of acquisition within a practice drill, the famous learning curve, or athlete performance at the end of a practice session is rarely accurate. Moreover, evaluation of learning effectiveness solely without efforts to ascertain accompanying changes in movement efficiency could similarly lead to misleading conclusions about the effectiveness of various interventions. Right? So they're pointing for the more need to assess transfer, retention, long-term things, right? And the thing I talked about a lot in my second book, efficiency, right? You may get no performance benefit, but still be improving because you're getting more efficient at something. Okay. So that, right. So we need to kind of find what's the right balance there between performance, which makes you confident, keeps you motivated, and long-term learning. Okay. So that's one thing they emphasize in there. Action point 2, focus on the quality rather than merely the quantity of practice. They refer a lot to obviously to Erickson deliberate practice. Um, when we're just passively accumulating hours of the same thing without increasing difficulty or challenging the person at 11, we're going to get limited skill acquisition. We're going to get what Anders called arrested development, or we're going to hit this plateau where we're not improving at all. We're just kind of because we're not being challenged enough. If athletes spend all their time practicing components of performance that are already well developed, or practice is set at appropriate level of challenge, is not set at appropriate level of challenge, the benefits of practice are significantly reduced and arrested development occur. Right? That's a lot of times what I see, where we spend a lot of time in practicing things we're already good at. Right? So that's an important point. The main evidence to suggest the talent point framework stems from research on contextual interference and variability of practice, showing support for conditioned practice that involve within and between task variability. A few weeks ago, I reviewed Wolfgang Schorhorn's meta-analysis challenging whether this is relevant to sport, whether this is binary between random and blocked. I think the general idea that we need to match the variability to the individual and the context is as I said, that is still relevant. Okay. Um, we can talk about, optimal challenge. That um, in Nikki Hodges and Keith Loach's extended challenge point out, they identified different roles of practice, right? Growing, improving, maintaining, right? They talk about these different things. Um, we talk about how, if we want to just maintain, maybe we can do low level of challenge. If we want to grow, we need a much higher level of challenge, right? And in my experience, we spend way too much time in the maintenance zone, right? We don't really need to practice that as much, right? So that's another thing they suggest in their paper. Okay, practical challenge. How do we get the right level of challenge, right? So this is kind of going back to the a little bit of what I talked about last week, the variable applying using variability to practice. How much do we add and when and why? right? How do we get that level right? How do we challenge the person on the right? There's been some recent models, the Spire model, right? So we need to assess the person. We need to figure out what they need to work on. We need to design and run things to uh, to achieve those goals. We need to feedback. We need to repeat and evaluate. So there are some kind of models, general frameworks of how to make practice more deliberate, get the right level of challenge. Like I said, the original challenge point framework does not have a lot of information about how do we find this magical optimal challenge, right? So that there are some things developing in that thing. They say partnerships between coaches and skill acquisition specialists are needed to progress towards a more data driven approach to identifying and designing high quality practice. Such an approach could generate exceptional large data sets, but recent advances in data analytics, machine learning, and artificial AI have significant potential to facilitate this process. This, I think this is an important thing. We're collecting so much data in practice. We could use that to better assess, are we challenging people at the right, evaluate interventions in terms of challenge and difficulty and what benefits are arising, right? So we need to have a more data driven, we have the opportunity to have a more data driven practice design. Okay. Action point number 3, create practice conditions that are specific to competition. Specificity of practice should not be confused with constant practice or a practice that limited to a range of practice experiences, specific practice. The argument favoring the importance of competition specificity and practice of effective retention and transfer is strong and has a long history. So this is again, they say they're this applies, it doesn't matter what you believe. I don't agree, right? Specificity of practice is not an idea that applies if you believe in ecological dynamics. I don't think. We focus on representative design, which is very different. It's focusing on having the key elements there: information, action fidelity, multiple affordances and decisions. Beyond that, making things specific to competition is not seen as necessary, right? In fact, moving away from competition and giving you problems to solve that you may never see in competition is actually beneficial, like in differential learning. Okay, so specificity rests on a continuum. There be trade-offs between competition similarity and practice quantity or repetition, right? The more close you get to competition, the less you have opportunity to repeat. How does a coach or athlete decide how much time should be spent in these various types of activities? And to what extent is specificity more important than high repetition? Right. So the idea is, if we're going to give you, I think a couple weeks ago I had the volleyball paper where I showed, having three interleaved options that were unpredictable was sufficient, right? To have, so we're getting reps, we're getting lots of reps of the same thing because there's only three options, but we're getting specific. The specificity comes through not knowing, having to make a decision, having information in the moment to make a decision. That's where the specificity comes. So I think we understand what we want to be similar is more important than this quantity. Well, maybe able to cast a vote in favor of high repetition, which may be partly why drill and grid-based practice have historically proven popular with coaches. There are concerns associated with spending time on activities that have lower resemblance to competition environment. If there's limited specificity, what, if anything, is being learned and will transfer to competition? Well, I think, differential learning research has shown that, the benefits of giving people problems to solve, right? That may be totally different than competition. Right? So I think there's a difference there. So within their within their kind of model, they refer to a figure that was in Nikki's and Keith's paper, talking about the individual challenge versus competition. So we don't want low competition, low specificity, and low challenge is not any use. Low specificity, high specificity, and high challenge may be too difficult. Moderate challenge and high specificity is where you're going to grow, and low challenge and high specificity competition is maintenance. Okay, so they divide it up into these different things. Okay. Um, in the extended challenge point framework, suggestions are made for scaling specificity dependent on goals for maintenance, learning, and competition transfer, which may offer some general guidance to coaches. However, we need a better understanding what specificity means in the context of different sports, perhaps by making greater use of data analytics and traditional task analysis to identify the demands of each sport and how they vary across age and skilled grouping. Yes, 100%. That's what I agree, right? That's what representative design gives to me. Representative design gives me a principled way to determine what I want similar between practice and competition. Everything else I can let go, right? That's why I like that. Okay. Action point number 4 in their framework. Consider individual differences in how learners respond to different interventions. Um, we know that people respond to we know, for example, if we look at variability to practice, we know variability to practice influences the rate at which you learn and retention and transfer and all those good things. What we're seeing more and more, right? There's this suggestion that there's not just a general overall effect that applies to everyone, right? It depends on age, level, skill level, things like resilience, mental toughness, how much you're willing to accept failure, right? So I think they're right. We need to kind of go beyond treating all athletes as the same. The ability to cope with failures or more areas may equally be an individual difference variable that impacts learning potential, right? So we need to both keep set the appropriate environment that we're going to challenge you, but also take into account that people may be different in their amount of failure they can handle. Okay? Action point number 5: facilitate learning during practice rather than dictate or abdicate. They point here to the optimal theory, which points to external focus of attention, athlete autonomy, things like that. They also so that in talking about this point, rather than prescription letting person find their own solution, they first one they point to is optimal. The second thing they point to is the CLA, right? And their critique of the CLA is this. They raise this the difficult with such an approach is determining what constraints should be manipulated and whether this change is sufficient to bring about learning in a timely manner once the constraint has been removed. While there are numerous ongoing updates to this framework with efforts to help coaches determine how and when to apply such methods, much more empirical work is needed to guide applied practice. Well, I think that's going on. Yeah, no, I think it's fair. We don't have a lot of. I think part of the problem is I can't people want cut and paste methods, right, with constraints. I can't tell you what constraints to use that's going to be effective for your athlete and your sport. What I try to give you is the logic for designing a constraint rather than that. And that's what we're trying to give people. So instead, yes, this is a limitation, right? And this goes back to the variability of practice paper too from last week. One of the limitations of is yes, we don't know exactly what constraint to use or how athletes going to respond to it. But in ecological dynamics, we reckon that we treat this as a fact of life, right? The complex adaptive system, this is going to be a fact of life, and we accept that instead of burying our head in the sand and saying, that it's not. What we recognize is coaches need to be adaptive. You need to, try things. You need to be observant and attuned to your environment, the playing environment, to see how athletes respond. You can't just set it and forget it, right? So I think this is fair, but it's also part and parcel of accepting that an athlete is a complex adaptive system. Okay. Um, so another thing, so from that, so that's kind of their framework. I don't know how much it's a framework. It's questions and kind of key things that they think need to be there. I don't think it has much specific that tells the coach, right? You need to go within the um, challenge, and you need to go within the theory to know how to do these, right? To me, they're just yes, we can pull out overall principles that come out, but to know how to actually get into the specifics, I think you need to get into the individual theories. Um, how the end is the future. How do we facilitate collaboration? There's an absence of ongoing support for coaches from skill acquisition practitioners and scientists beyond the prevails of short classroom exposure certification course. They receive a lot. There's a lot, no, not as much. Um, the coaches learn on the job mostly without direct supervision. So we need more skill acquisition infused in everywhere in coaching. Agreed. So I think that's a good point. Um, there's very few roles for skill acquisition specialists. The present company accepted. The coaches, people have this. One of the problems they note is people have this inaccurate perception that coaches themselves are skill acquisition specialists, or skill acquisition specialists are coaches. They're one and the same. No, they're different things. Coaches do not have the specific knowledge and understanding of the science underpinning effective learning possessed by skill acquisition specialists, where in contrast, the latter by large do not have the level of craft and sports specific knowledge possessed by coaches. 100%. I 100% agree. I am not a good coach, right? I am a skill acquisition specialist. They're different things. These roles are not in competition. They should be facilitated and collaborated. They inform each other and expedite knowledge creation. Agreed, right? So we need to keep pushing for getting skill acquisition specialists more involved in coaching at high levels. Okay. So that's it for this paper. As I said, I think it's an interesting look at where we were and where we are, right? So we still have these kind of, so that we have some of these general principles that we're moving towards, right? Yes, I agree with the authors. You can pull out some of these general action points that they, but to know how we're going to address them, then you have to dive down into the theory. So I don't think you can sit above the theory, as the authors try to point out. But overall, I think it's a really good read. I would highly recommend you have a look. Okay, that's it for now. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.